The day before we left on Tuesday, the clip from Jeff's presentation in Franklin at the Fight, Love, Feast, Slap Each Other, whatever it was called, thing, which I was not invited to at all, never even mentioned, but I won't say anything more about that. Anyway, the clip where Jeff was talking about the woke church. In fact, he was asked to talk about way too many things in a relatively short period of time, and I'm not really sure if they understand Jeff's struggles with the subject of time. Everyone at Apologia is fully aware of Jeff's struggles with the issue of time. In fact, just last night, he had to cut his sermon literally in half. He will just have to complete it next week because Jeff struggles with time. Anyway, they evidently didn't know that, so they gave him a whole lot to do, and he was talking about epistemology and just the whole problem with the pro-life industry, as he likes to call it, which is self-propagating and dealing with abortion arguments and all the rest of this stuff. But as most of you know, the conflict that came out of those clips was the fact that right toward the end of the sermon, Jeff purposefully, having spoken to two of his three other elders, but not me, I wasn't there, remember, I wasn't invited, had talked to others, purposefully, in his notes, went full Luther. Okay, so Jeff was shooting to be included in a future edition of Table Talk, and I'm not talking about Ligonier's Table Talk. There's a lot of difference between Ligonier's Table Talk magazine, which is a wonderful magazine, by the way. But Luther wouldn't do well with the modern version of Table Talk. But Table Talk was the discussions that Luther would have with other theologians, but especially his students, around, I'm thinking of the room right now. I've been in the room where it took place, around these rough wooden benches in rural Germany. And Luther would utilize examples from life, which means in the early 1520s in rural Germany included piles of manure and flies. Now, we sat down yesterday, all the elders, and we had a chat about this because the argument in Jeff's sermon was we need to say what the prophets said and do what the prophets did. And I have, over the past 15 years, and especially over the past 5 years, more than once had to disagree with people who were using a very similar argument. At least linguistically, it's the same argument. So people who will say that you can approach, for example, Muslims in the most egregiously disrespectful and repulsive fashion, because that's what Elijah would have done. That's what Elijah would have done. That's what Ezekiel would have done, you see? And so if you can point to something within that context of the prophets, then you can utilize that and still be godly in how you're approaching. You can say it, the Spirit of God led you to do these things. I have responded to that in pointing out that 1 Peter chapter 3 tells us that however you do the exegesis, when we get a prosopologion, when we give a reasoned defense for the hope that's within us, we are to do so with gentleness and reverence. Now, that reverence may well be partly because we're handling the scriptures and the gospel and the message of what God has done in his son, Jesus Christ. But you can't get around the fact that gentleness and reverence there is primarily in the attitude you're supposed to have to the person with whom you're speaking. Now, that was a person who asked you for the hope. That's not necessarily the same as a false teacher, a false prophet. I get that. But the general attitude of the Christian and that whole section, remember, I have a whole sermon on 1 Peter 3:15 that if you haven't heard it, would be relevant right now. That whole section is basically saying that it's commanding that Christians, all Christians, not just ministers, but all Christians, treat the Messiah as Yahweh in our hearts. It's drawn from Isaiah. Got a whole sermon on, I go back into the Old Testament, give you the background. And the whole thing is that if we purposely each and every day recognize who Jesus really was as God incarnate, and then use that as the ordering principle for everything else, it's going to change our lives in such a way that people are going to ask us about the hope that's within us because they're going to see that hope within us. And the only way they can see that is if we are speaking with gentleness and reverence. If we allow our self-righteousness, our self-defense to come to the fore, they're not going to be asking us. That's going to get in the way. So that's why it has to be with gentleness and reverence, despite the fact that, wow, it's an amazing and powerful thing to think about the fact Jesus was Yahweh in human flesh. I am a servant of the God-man. Man, you could go a long ways with that if you wanted to substantiate some kind of authoritarian, in-your-face type behavior. But Peter says with gentleness and reverence. With gentleness and reverence. And so, with that in mind, that when the apostle is talking to Christians in general in the congregation, I think this is our default mode. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, so it will give grace to those who hear. That term unwholesome is sapros. And that can mean weak and not able to do what it's supposed to do, but it can also mean just simply bad, as in unclean, as in earthy. And so the contrast is between a sapros logos and an agathos logos that is good for oikadameo, to build up according to the need of the moment. And so what we want to do is we want to build up according to the need of the moment with our speech. Now, like I said, we had conversation. I expressed the fact that if I had been asked, I would have said, don't go there. Don't use that language. I fully understand exactly why. Again, he explained it in the sermon, but then we had the opportunity to lay it out with less stress as we were talking. His motivation was very straightforward. We live in a day where political correct speech has numbed the passions in the mind. And the reality is that Scripture does use strong language for infidelity. Hosea, go marry a prostitute. And yep, in the prophets, when God talks about Israel's constant spiritual fornication, it uses strong, vivid language. Really strong, vivid language of whoredom and equally socially unacceptable terminology. No question about it. In fact, if you've not read Ezekiel, you really should, because obviously if you just haven't read the whole Bible, you should, but the point being that you're leaving yourself open to being left staying there stuttering if you're trying as a Christian to give an answer within like a college campus situation. There's some tough stuff in there. God called Ezekiel to do stuff that I don't think he's calling any of us to do today. That's one of the issues. But it's there. And what that does mean, and what Jeff was saying, and what he wanted to communicate, is that there are things being inflicted upon the church, brought into the church, that are hiding behind how we used to do church. These people are using our own language. They are assuming the lines of battle of the past. And yet what they're bringing in is such a destructive, divisive ideology that it will enslave those who embrace it. And so he was basically saying, if you as a shepherd are going to feed your people woke BS, then you need to be marked out for what you really are, as a false shepherd who's abusing the sheep. Luther would be sitting around going, why are you all talking about this? I have no earthly idea why you're even talking. Okay, I get that. But my feed was filled with lots of people who were just simply saying, I don't care what the context was. You just don't do that. Okay? Jeff's not trying to say that you should. And by the way, I should tell you, I've known Jeff for many years now. And I know him much better now over the past couple of years because we talk all the time. It's the first time I ever heard him use off-color language. And he did it purposefully. It was in the notes. It had a point and a purpose. And this is what I said. I said two things. One, the argument is we need to use the serrated edge. Now, I actually grabbed a knife out of I have an entire drawer full I like knives. And looky that, I didn't even try to. What's that? It's a serrated edge. That's the serration right there. Now, I can tell you something. Sadly, I must admit, I'm going to tell you something. The only person who's ever been hurt by a serrated edge knife that I own is me. Those suckers will get you. They will grab you. They will cut you. That's just what serrated edges do. And my point is that there is grave danger with the tongue. And we are warned of that in Scripture. There are many Christians who struggle mightily with sanctification in the area of the tongue. Jeff isn't one of them. Not in my experience, not in my presence. But there are a lot of people who do. When you talk about the serrated edge, be aware. And here's what I said to my fellow elders. I said, even if I was convinced that this is a freedom that we possess to utilize that kind of language, I couldn't do it because I'm not mature enough to. I'll just be honest. I'm not mature enough to. Why? Doug Wilson is attacked more often than I am, but I'm up there in the running with the amount of slander and nastiness and just the kind of constant vitriol. And I'll be honest with you, that puts you in a situation of thinking you're like Ezekiel. And that means it's okay if you blast back with what they blast you with. I would not have the maturity to utilize. It's sort of like one of those situations where you may have the freedom to engage in a particular activity, but you realize it'd be better for you if you didn't. Certain films to see, music to listen to, activities to engage in, whatever. And you go, you know what? And that would be one. I would have to go, I think I need to refrain. Even if I was convinced, I'm not convinced, but even if I was convinced, I couldn't do it. I'm not mature enough. So we had the conversation. I'm trying to be consistent. Jeff would know that For all the years he's known me, that has been one of the key terms that I have used and certainly passed on to him, the issue of consistency. I've tried to be consistent over the years on this subject without becoming dogmatic in a tradition. I am willing to hear the other side. But I just believe there are certain terms, and Jeff agrees with me. There are certain terms that never should be used, period. This was mild, and it was the type of language that doesn't fall into the same category as the four-letter bombs that people talk about and that unfortunately appear on our Twitter feeds almost every day. But I need to be consistent. So anyway, the point is, Jeff's going to do a Apologia Radio episode, I think tomorrow or the next day. I forget which one it was. I think it said Tuesday, but it all depends on the schedule. And he's going to address some of these things and probably mention that, we've had this talk and that I come down to a different conclusion. But I think if you've listened to what I said, you see that we're really not all that far apart. It's a personal decision as to how free I would feel. What you need to hear, and what I think he would certainly want you to hear. He did not do this off the cuff. As I said, he not only prayed about it, it was in his notes. He had talked with 2 of the 3 other elders about the subject, one of whom was there. So it wasn't just an off the cuff, I'm going to try to shock everybody type thing. And I think he's also going to talk about some of the twofold apologetic methodology, answering the fool according to his fall. I think he'll probably bring up some of that too. But the point was, it wasn't just an off the cuff type thing. I'm going to try to shock everybody. The issue was, this stuff is exactly as worthy of the opprobrium that we heap upon it as the things that Luther identified in the same way from the papacy. This stuff is destructive, and the longer we tiptoe around and not lay it out for what it is, the worse things are going to get for all of us. And we're going to see more and more churches split, more and more ministries. Actually, what I'm seeing, honestly, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it almost seems to me like you're getting a reshuffling amongst the churches and people who are just getting tired of, because here's the problem. Once a church gets infected with woke ideology, you can't have verse by verse exegetical preaching in a woke church. You can't, because the whole idea behind woke ideology is this is the most important thing that we are called to do. All balance is lost. And so people who want that, who used to get that in the church they were at, when it changes, they're going to leave. And they're going to go to places where they're still getting a balance. That means those of us that are opposing it can't just do this. It is the need of the moment. There needs to be teaching on it. There needs to be interaction. That's why we're going to be playing, we're going to be listening to Jamar Tisby, and we're going to be reading the words of these individuals and hearing what they're saying and analyzing how they are participating in the war on language by redefining it within the church. So we're going to name names. We're going to lay out what the case is. We can't do anything other than that. But that's not all we're supposed to be doing. Jeff's overly long sermon last night, which, overly long because we've got to divide it in halfway through. It was probably too big to start with, is on all the passages that identify Jesus as the Messiah. That is really basic stuff, but how many Christians can go to the Old Testament and prove that Jesus is the Messiah? Most people are like, don't even ask me a question about that. So, I did the Trinity last week. We did the inspiration of Scripture. And we've been doing all these other things. So this isn't the only thing we're talking about, but it is the need of the moment. And it could become even more so the need of the moment depending on what happens in the next literally number of weeks. So yeah, you can't dodge it either. But you try to remain balanced. And so if you haven't gotten the idea, I am so thankful for the open communication and relationship that exists amongst myself and my fellow elders, and the great respect that I have for Jeff and Luke and Zach. And so the freedom that I have, there aren't many situations like what you have right here. You have two ministries with differing emphases, global outreaches, but there's an interface, me. And it's not easy to necessarily navigate all the things that come up from that. I'm just very thankful in this situation. It was a wonderful meeting that we walked away from edified, and hopefully my comments today have been edifying as well for everybody else.